Hey everybody, I'm Tammy Kiekefer. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
And my name is Desiree Grimaldi. Welcome to Unguarded Minds podcast, where we talk about all the drama, trauma, and gritty things that life throws at you. Today we have a special guest, Abbie. She is a former UK police sergeant. She served for 6 years. She was incredibly passionate about her work and was promoted within 3 years. But then she fell seriously ill a year later with stress, burnout, and trauma caused by the events both in her personal and professional life. On her road to recovery, she discovered a completely different approach to healing than the one that she was taught in the police force, working with body and somatics and the nervous system. This became her new passion, and 2 years later, she walked away from what once was her dream job to qualify as a somatic breathwork practitioner and run her own coaching business. So that is awesome. Thank you for joining us, Abbie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Good.
So you started out as a police officer in the UK. Was that like always a childhood dream to go? Do you come from a family that was in the police force, or what led you to that path to begin with?
So it wasn't a childhood dream, and I actually didn't have any family members who were in the police. It was more towards when I was about 18, and I met the woman who was in the police I was on a training course, and she had just joined the police, and it's not something I'd ever thought about, but I remember she had kind of stopped me and just said, "Have you ever thought about joining the police?" And I said, "No, it's not for me." But it must have planted a seed, because I can remember going home that night, and I started to look at the career, and then all of a sudden I was like, I want to do that. That is me. And that kind of was the start of the path and the start of the dream at that point.
Awesome.
So you were 18 when she planted the seed, and then how soon after did you join the police force?
So it was a while until I could join. At that time in our country, they'd just made austerity measures to the frontline services. So it was about, I think, between 8 to 10 years later before they would start to recruit again. So I just had this dream that started at the point where they had frozen recruitment. So it wasn't going to be for a long time until I could do that career. So it was about 8 to 10 years later. But in that time, there was a lot of hard work and preparing myself for the job and taking opportunities that I thought would put me in a good position for when I reached that dream and got to do that job.
So you had a lot of time to really think about it. So yeah. Okay.
Wow, they're like begging people to join the police here and like getting them in the next day.
Right.
We have a shortage. So when you joined the police force, is it more male dominant in the UK? Like, is it a more male dominant profession?
I think it's a lot more equal now. Although I will say that as you start to go up through the ranks, you see a lot more male in those positions. I know that they are looking to try and change that, but what I will say is, even though there's an equal split of male and females, like the masculine energy is very dominant even in a lot of those females. So it still feels like it's a male dominated environment from that perspective.
Yeah. And so what was it like for you being on the police force?
So I think at first I joined and I had just gone through a big bereavement. So just before I joined, I lost my mum. So that ultimately changed my journey and my experience, because it's a big commitment. There's a lot of responsibility and there's a lot of training and there's a lot to get used to. So you need to be on your game from the very first day. But I was going through this huge life-changing experience of losing my mum. And I found very early on that the environment, there wasn't a lot of room for grief, and there wasn't going to be a lot of room for emotions. And I worked in two different police forces. So the first one that I worked in and the first one that I joined just wasn't a very compassionate environment. So I ended up just stuffing everything away, pushing my feelings and my grief locking them away and just getting my head down and pushing on. And I'm a very driven person, I still am, but that I just put all of my energy and efforts into doing well in my career. So the first few years were hard, but I gave it my all. And like anything in life, you get out what you put in. So I had an incredible few years and I did really well and I was just so driven and it was a great experience. And I was living my dream just with you know, it was just tainted with a little bit of sadness at that point.
And kind of like a ball of grief that you weren't able to deal with, kind of lingering in that background. So is that something that kind of came up later on, or like, because you said that you got ill, so what happened with you?
So yeah, I think what I realized is that I was just in this mindset approach of just chasing goals, looking after the next thing, and not really dealing with my emotions. And because I'd pushed myself so hard, I got promoted and I was always moving on to the next thing and just trying to focus on growing. What happened was when I hit that period of burnout, that's when all the emotions and everything that I've been avoiding and hiding came to the surface as well. It was at a point where I had nowhere to go. So it was a bit of a double whammy of um, being in that exhaustion and burnout, and then having all this trauma that I thought I'd kind of just packed away, and that came to the surface. So it was a really, really deeply challenging time because the burnout had led to physical health problems, and then I had the mental health problems. So it was a like a volcano erupting. Mm.
It's so true. You think you're doing okay. You think, you're just going day by day by day and stuff, and but the accumulation of it, you don't understand what a huge impact that has. And until it hits, and I always think like, okay, you can stuff it away as long as you want to, but your body is always talking to you and it's going to come up whether you want it to or not. Did you feel like you were getting little warning signs from your body that like, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Did you feel like that was happening?
Yeah, and I think was so disconnected from my body that when I reflect back now, there were so many things that were giving me signals from my body, and I was just using my mindset to override and override. Because we're taught
Hmm.
that mindset is everything. We think
Hmm.
that actually we've got, this powerful tool in our mind. But essentially all that did was my body had to completely shut down and make me stop. And I had to reach that crisis point before I would even begin to take notice. I wouldn't have taken notice like any stage early at that point because I was just like, yeah, just use the mindset and just push forward, keep moving through.
Yeah.
And now when I reflect, all the signs were there in my physical body, and I just didn't know how to relate to them. I didn't recognize them. I didn't speak the language of my body, and I just was like, yeah, we'll just keep pushing through. Didn't allow myself to rest. Wouldn't allow myself to sleep. I was just in that mode. So what happened to me was the only way that I was actually ever going to learn another way. I was
Mm.
just so tunnel vision in that space I was in.
Do you think it was kind of a coping mechanism for you? Just because you had just lost your mom, and maybe at the
Hmm.
beginning it was like, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to feel that. There's so much grief. Was that a coping mechanism?
I think it's probably a combination of, yes, being like a self-protection mechanism, and also it wasn't that I was scared of my emotions, but I just had never been taught anything that helped me to process them, to sit with them, to understand them. So I didn't really know what to do with them.
Hmm.
So I think that it was like it was a bypass, but a bypass that existed in the absence of having any tools or skills that could actually help me deal with them.
Hmm. So in your family, were you the way that you grew up, were there a lot of emotions? Were there a lot of like, did people talk about their emotions? Did they feel their emotions? Or yeah.
I would say it was emotional, but not in a way that was intelligent. So I think people would, keep things inside and then have a blow up. that really didn't know how to communicate. I think it's a global thing, really, that I'm not actually really taught how to sit with emotions. And, I think in our current, cultures and society, I think emotions are seen as weak. So I think it's a natural learned behavior, and also an absence of being shown those tools and skills from a family environment too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you're definitely not born learning to read your body. It's a something that needs to be role modeled and reinforced and taught. So in the police department, you've probably been through some traumatic things being a police officer and seen a bunch of things that could really mess with your mind. Did they do debriefings? I was just wondering, after like a traumatic experience, if they did any debriefing, if that would sort of bring up some of those emotions that you were stuffing down.
So what I find, and still this is very true of the two different forces I worked for, was that you are incident after incident after incident, but there's really very little processing time. You are literally just on this continuum where you go from one thing to the next. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that unless it's something that's really big and really serious, there's
Mm.
very little briefing time. So actually, at the end of the day, you've been to that many jobs and dealt with that many things
Yeah.
that you might have emotions and moods, but you actually can't really relate it to anything because everything's just like a big bowl of soup, essentially. That's kind of how I found it.
So you got desensitized? Is that what you mean?
Not desensitized, I would say more disconnected.
Okay.
And I suppose that if you had something happen to you into your life, and you would be able to see like the effect that had. So if we're looking at cause and effect, say I had an argument with someone today and I felt a little bit down in the afternoon, you could relate that to that experience. But you're going to that many things and you're being pulled in so many different directions that you can't link your emotions to your specific experience. So it can be quite confusing. And
Mm-hmm.
now reflecting back on my experiences from the perspective of working with the nervous system, I realized that actually that desensitization and disconnection is like a self-protection and a dysregulated nervous system, and not being able to, look after your own health because you are literally pulled in that many different directions. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was probably, whilst the incidents and things I experienced, some of them, were traumatic, but they never really deeply impacted me. I was always able to keep that distance. So I think that disconnection and not being able to link or relate to my emotions or regulate my emotions was definitely a big influence in the bigger picture as to what I had going on. And it kind of all came to a head when I became unwell.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Did the police force encourage you guys to seek like mental health even on your own time from dealing with stuff like that?
I think it's probably better now than it ever has been. Although the support, I don't feel it accurately reflects the unique challenges of our role. So we have a counselling line that we could call if we needed to speak to somebody, and we had a welfare team. But really, I still feel like that it just weren't at the level that we needed. And I find a lot of officers in that case just say no thanks, and it doesn't really give them the support that they need. I find that it's still very clinical and focused on the mind, and there's no somatic practices in the police. And whilst we all need the clinical approach, I think when we're in the police and we need that support, it's all the relational elements. So the questions are, how am I going to sleep tonight? How do I get better? How do I get support from my family? That's just not really addressed in the support that we're offered or that's available to us.
I come from a family of law enforcement. And I mean, I've asked my brother-in-law and people like, how do you even let your family leave the house. Like after being out there all day and doing, and I know that the police are very different here than the UK. I mean, most UK police aren't even allowed to carry like firearms, correct?
Yeah.
So like seeing the stuff that we would see here, and I'm like, how do you let the kids leave? I would never let that, like, but him specifically, he is so good about leaving it at the door, and you would never know what he experienced that day. But I also know we've had some other guests on here that said that it's not like the mental health is not available. It's not something that's pushed. It's not something that's offered. But it's definitely a huge need across the board. And so you focus healing blue hearts, guiding frontline workers. So that's your focus, is people coming from that background or in that profession, that you help through that. Do you find that they're more open to you? Because you said when it is suggested or offered within the police force, they typically say no. So because you're somebody from the outside with experience, do you find that they're more open and willing to like work with you as opposed to who the department would recommend?
I think the advantage of my business is that I have been in that position, and I think that a lot of frontline workers, especially police officers, they trust the voice of another police officer, knowing that we've got that shared experience, and there's just an understanding, like a mutual understanding, and things that we don't have to explain. We just get each other and each other's experience. And I've also found that to be really beneficial when I've been working on coaching with a one-to-one client, and there's just certain barriers that aren't there because I get where they're coming from, and the things that they don't have to explain. So there is definitely that advantage of listening to somebody who's, you can relate to and resonate with. And I think what I've found out is maybe a lot of police officers who have had a challenging experience and then they leave the force, not many of them are sharing their stories or going back to, support in a different capacity. So it's something new as well, and something that I think is received well, because I'm not just going back with a service, so I'm openly sharing my story and telling them about my experiences. And that's from a really empowered place to say, actually, I've had this really challenging experience. I had a lot of trauma, and actually I'm in this position now where I'm not just saying these things, but they can see that I'm embodying that actually I'm in a really good place, and I can manage my emotions, and I can stand here and talk about it. And I think that there's no really better example or more powerful experience than to hear and see that in front of you, and then to see what's possible.
Now that you have these tools, do you ever miss being on the police force? Like, do you ever think like, gosh, if I was capable of doing this then, like where would my career be now as a police officer?
Yeah, for sure. I joined the police and thought that was going to be my forever career. I think never in a million years did I think that in 6 years' time you're going to be sitting on the other side. I would have just laughed and thought, absolutely not. You're crazy. And there are times that I just think if I had these tools and these skills like offered to me, I would still be there and living my dream. And I suppose that's the beauty of having a purpose-led business, is that, I wanted to go back and make sure that anyone else who had any of those experiences could preserve their job and to keep doing the job that they love without suffering with their health, or preserving their relationships and, protecting their well-being at the same time. So I feel really passionate about the work that I'm doing for that reason, because it's almost like going back and giving the skills that I wished had been available to me when I joined.
And so the officers that you work with, do you see that you're helping them prolong their career in the force because you're teaching them the skills that you're learning and that you learned?
Yeah, I think prolonging their career and reducing the harm of policing.
Yeah.
And I know I'm writing a book at the moment. It's an ebook on well-being for emergency workers,
Hmm.
and some of the facts and figures around frontline workers, especially police officers, are that we are significantly exposed to more trauma than your average member of the public. I think
Of
that one of
course.
the one that stands out is that a police officer will experience 400 to 600 traumatic events in their career on average. And then if you compare that to a civilian in the general population, they typically experience 3 to 4. But what's also really shocking is that we have an elevated suicide rate in the police, and
Hmm.
5.3% more deaths by suicide occurred in 2023 than those that were killed in active service. So actually, we think we're doing a dangerous job, and we think going out there and protecting the front line and dealing with these incidents is the
Hmm.
dangerous part. But actually,
Wow.
mental health is really, really significantly, a bigger risk.
And with that statistic, do you feel like they're encouraging people more and more? I guess that kind of goes back to Desiree's question, but suicide rate is so high. And but then I understand, and I'm not sure if it's similar in the UK, but you might not get a promotion if you go seek mental health services, and it can hold you back in your career. Is that the same? I mean, it's kind of a
Mm.
double-edged sword there.
Yeah, I still feel like that stigma is, I think it depends where you work.
Hmm.
I've definitely found that in the first force, I felt that. But in the second force that I worked for, I didn't have that, and I felt like I had permission to be human, and that when I've gone through challenges, I was supported through those, and that it wouldn't influence my career. But I think those in specialist roles, like you mentioned firearms before, they have to declare if they're going through mental health challenges, and it could result in their, firearms license being temporarily suspended. So yeah, I
Hmm.
can imagine that for someone in that position, that would feel like, your career is influenced and could cause somebody to hide their mental
Hmm.
health for fear
Yeah.
of what that's going to mean for their career.
It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating as a counselor, because you want to help people, but they won't open up all the way, or they're very cautious about what they'll share. They ask me, are you writing this down? Is this documented? They're just like, they want help, but they're afraid to
Mm.
open up. And, or they don't even get into counseling. But then here's your, frontline officers and people who you want them to be spot on, but we're human. You can't go through, what'd you say, 400 to 600 traumatic experiences in a lifetime. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
You can't go through that and continue to just be everything's fine without getting some help. It's just, I don't know. It's frustrating.
Well, on
Mm.
top of it, I mean, the time frame that you said, like suicides went up, that was also through COVID. That was through that, like there was so much already going on in that time frame, and that people needed mental health services for, on top of all of the
Yeah.
traumatics. Yeah, that's crazy. I think it should be like mandatory. I mean, we've talked about it for the US. I think that it should be something that's mandatory. It should be outside the police force, and it should all be confidential.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So what was your breaking point when you said, I am out. I can't do this anymore. I've got to take care of myself. Are you okay talking about that?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Okay.
Only because I've made such good progress, and like I say, I
Yeah.
am literally on the other side. So my journey, I'll just take you back to the time when I was unwell and burned out and going through trauma. I accidentally discovered the world of somatic, which just basically means body-based practices. I thought I was going for a meditation class online, and it turned out to be a breathwork class.
Hmm.
And in that breathwork session, I had this emotional release. And I didn't make the connection at first because it wasn't a breath, it was like on an app, so it didn't explain what could happen. But when I did it 2 more times, because I really enjoyed the breath work, I then thought, hang on a minute. Every time I've done this breath work, I've had this emotional release. So it got me curious. So then I decided to do a bit of research. And then I found that it was actually a thing that you can have emotional release through breath work. And it just blew my mind. I thought that all the things that are available, counseling, therapies, like I have found this one thing that actually has given me more of an emotional release and helped me release stress from the body. And it really sparked just like a passion to learn more. And that's when I started working with my own coach. So I worked with a one-to-one coach for about 6 months, and he taught me nervous system regulation work. And I think that combined with the breath work, I just saw my whole life completely change and my outlook change, and the way that I was running my mind, my brain, my body was completely different. And I wanted to share that with my colleagues. So I began my own qualifications and set up my own business. And I suppose that I wanted to deliver them into the force, but they weren't so open to it. And the other police officers wanted to learn about it, but the internal government structures and they weren't so keen. They wanted to just stick with the things that they were doing. And I suppose I just had a calling that if I don't go away and do this now, I'm just sitting on all these tools and skills that I know are going to help people. So it was a real calling to do that. And I decided I can always come back to the police, but I might not have this opportunity again. So I left in April this year, April, May time.
Wow. Okay. So you're fresh out.
Yeah.
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 No regrets?
No.
Good.
100% right decision.
Good. That's how you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure your family feels some relief too, like that you're not on that side of it anymore. Because it's not just the police who go through it. I mean, their family goes through it, worrying every time they go out, and I don't think that they get as much recognition as they need for mental health advocacy as well.
Yeah, that is a really good point that you've made.
And did they see you like more stressed and more stressed? Was your family talking to you about, hey, Abbie, you gotta take care of yourself. Are you okay? Or you guys didn't really talk about emotions a lot growing up. So did they bring up anything to you?
No, not at the time, but I think when I had started to do the work with my coach in somatics and I had really big breakthroughs, I think I started naturally talking about it quite openly. And I think that from that moment on, I think that just opened the dialogue and I share very openly now. And the dynamics have changed a lot because of that. So it just goes to show it just takes sometimes one person to change and it can have a really big impact.
That's interesting, of course. Yeah. So so if someone comes to you, can you explain kind of the breath work and what you do and what that looks like? And when you said emotional release, I had a question like, was it tears? Was it exhaustion? Was it laughing? Yeah, I'm just curious what that looks like.
So I'll talk about breathwork first, the style of breathwork that I'll do, and then I'll touch on the emotional release. So I am qualified in a breathwork that's called somatic breathwork. So as we discovered, it's basically of the body, and it's a practice that helps us reconnect the mind back to the body so they can work in harmony together. Because if they're not working as one, they're working as two separate entities. That was what was happening to me when I was trying to override my body constantly with my mind and ended up ill. And when we use the breath in that way to go into the body, it helps us to release stress, anxiety, tension, energy, trauma that's been stuck in the body. And that release often looks like an expression. And that expression will be very different every time you do breath work. So it can range from happiness, laughter, it could be yawning, moving your body, and it also could be shouting, frustration, anger, tears, grief. So it can look very different. And sometimes it could be that you don't have an expression and that you might fall asleep and you might feel very tired. I recently worked with a friend who did a session, and she didn't have any emotional release, but she's somebody that doesn't express her emotions and tends to shut down. But what she did have later that night was her body was achy, and what that happened, that showed us that her emotions are expressed physically because she doesn't release them. And she said, actually, I don't talk about my emotions and I end up with a headache. So it just showed her how our body was processing, emotional release. Like when you release emotions and if you don't express them, you know, it's the physical symptoms that she notices instead. So it can be incredibly powerful in that we don't have to know why they're there, what they're from, how they got there, and what we're going to do going forward. Bypass is the conscious mind, and that we don't have to think about it. So we can have this release, and we don't have to sit and use our minds to talk about it. It's great. Sometimes we need a break from our minds, and I found breathwork to be, such a perfect practice for that.
And so, yeah, I guess it's any way that your body expresses any kind of emotion or pent up. Yeah. So, do you use it in combination? Do you feel like, okay, so say someone has a pretty traumatic experience that they went through, and maybe their conscious, subconscious mind, whatever, needs to process that at some point. Do you feel like the breath work happens first so that they're able to process that? Or have you found that the breath work is enough? Or what are your findings with that?
So a few points on this one. So it depends where somebody was at with their trauma. So if it was something very recent and they were experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, I would feel that for me that's outside of my scope of practice, and I would 100%, direct them to somebody who's qualified to work with that acute, very raw trauma. I tend to work a lot more with, people who, when we look at trauma from the perspective, it's about our experiences and what stays with us from those experiences and the impact it can have and releasing those emotions. So we're working with people that, have stress and traumas in their life, but it's not active, if that makes sense. So we're not having someone who's having PTSD flashbacks that, I might do more harm than good. So I'd always be there on the side of caution. But what I do say to people with breathwork, that yes, it bypasses the conscious mind and we can have a release, and as a standalone practice is great, but there will sometimes come a time where we need to go and do the deeper work. And I like to use this analogy of, if somebody was graffitiing outside of your house and drawing on your front door, you could have a great cleaner that cleans that off. But if that was happening over and over again, actually your more intelligent response is to actually who's doing it and why is it happening, and trying to stop that person. So just to remind them it's not a bypass, and it's not a something that you're going to use all the time. But if you have something that is constantly re-triggering that stress and anxiety, you might have to go and do that work and find out what's causing it, so that you're not using all your energy just cleaning it away. And I do a deeper nervous system work in relation to polyvagal theory, which is more of a one-to-one experience and nervous system work that can help them really understand their reactivity, their triggers, and teach them how to actually regulate and sit with their emotions. And that combined with the breath work is a really great tool together as a really powerful healing modality.
So, do you use the breath work? Maybe it's different, but alongside of meditation and yoga, I was just thinking body movement to also work through all those energy channels. Or how does that combine?
So my practice is just the breath work. However, you are right that breath work and yoga, they go hand in hand. So that I have been, approached by people who are, a breath worker and yoga in terms of retreats and things like that. But that would maybe necessarily not be focused at frontline workers, but just people who are in that space and love yoga and breath work. But you're right that the two of them are pretty compatible and
Hmm.
provide like an even deeper experience.
Hmm. I had read something a long time ago, but that, like, your lungs, we only really use 10% of our lung capacity. But and I catch myself, I'll just like be just breathing and probably using just a teeny bit of my
Mm,
lung capacity. But then when you completely fill up your lungs, it is such a refreshing feeling. But you don't sit there and all day long. But it sounds
yeah,
like we should.
yeah. So I found that with the breath work that so it's diaphragmatic breathing.
Hmm.
So breathing into the diaphragm, and a lot of us lose access to this area
Hmm.
because we are just breathing very shallow, and it's actually around this area where we store a lot of emotions and stress. So that's why using the diaphragmatic breathing, we go for depth,
Hmm.
and it helps to release that from the body. But a really interesting thing that I like to tell a lot of my frontline workers is that actually, when you breathe really shallow, what you're doing is keeping your body almost like tempered, and you're almost keeping it in it's almost like keeping your car batteries on overnight.
Hmm.
Because if you emulate the breathing of that short, shallow breathing, which is that's obviously emphasized, but what that is that if you were running and then you're in fight or flight, but it's just
Uh-huh.
a very like muted version of that. So actually, when we just breathe really shallow, we're like keeping our nervous systems more like tempered towards the activation, the fight or flight, which can drain
Yes.
our energy. I always say to put a hand on your diaphragm, take a deep breath into your diaphragm, and elongate the exhale, just to switch that rest and digest side of your nervous system on. It's a really great technique.
Yes. I like that. You're
Mm.
right. That the breath is completely tied to the nervous system.
Yeah.
So, and I
Make a
always
note.
go write this down. And sometimes it's hard to, when you're anxious, I think it's hard to take that deep inhale, which almost makes you more panicky because you're like, I can't breathe. But I found if you can exhale fully, involuntarily, your body kicks in and you can get that next breath. So a lot of times people are focused on, I can't breathe in, I can't breathe in, but you don't think to exhale everything. But I guess that kind of goes along with what you're saying. The breath and the nervous system are so connected.
Yeah, and just what you said there is right on that actually to activate your rest and digest, like part of the nervous system, you focus on the exhale,
Mm,
elongate that exhale, and that's how you switch it on. Because if you see videos of animals being chased in the wild by a predator, and then that threat ends, you see that they actually take that deep breath
oh, interesting.
at the very end when the stress is gone, and that's
Mm-hmm.
like the body's like resetting.
Mm,
So actually, it's like how you switch it on. You send that signal to your body that you are safe when you breathe into the diaphragm and you elongate that exhale. It sends that signal to the body and the nervous system. So it's like a,
yeah.
yeah.
And it's true. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know what I also learned is, and maybe you do this too, I was just thinking about this exhale thing. When you're eating and you get to a point where you go, that means you're full. But a lot of times it's when I'm eating my appetizer and my meal hasn't even come yet. And I have a choice. Do I want to but it's so interesting because it's when I'd never paid attention to it, but then I did, and I'm like, I am kind of full,
Mm.
and maybe my body is satisfied with as much as that I've had already, and I don't need the rest of it. But it was an interesting um, technique when you're losing weight or on a diet or being more conscious of your food intake, that exhale is saying, enough, stop. Yeah.
Well, it makes complete sense because when you are in your stressed part of your nervous system, your digestion is aborted essentially, and all your energy is going to, escape in survival mode. So the fact that you are then attuned to your digestion means that you've then gone into that parasympathetic rest and
Hmm.
digest. So yeah,
Yeah.
like it's that signal of like satisfaction, safety, peace.
Hmm. Yeah. don't realize how much the breath is an indicator that when you're in tune with it, you can completely regulate your emotions and manage, even though stressful things happen in your life, you can try to stay ahead of it by paying attention to your breath, I guess, is what you're teaching people.
Yeah, because the breath controls the nervous system, and the nervous system is where we experience life. And I always say, just like the body knows how to heal a cut or a wound or grow its hair, you have the tools within to actually work with that, your emotions and your experience of life. I think it's just we've been conditioned to think, I feel stressed or anxious. We look externally for a cure, but you have the breath within. And when you learn to use that consciously, you have a really powerful tool at your disposal.
I love that. Super empowering. Yeah. Well, how can people find you? If you do you work with people outside of the UK? Or are you focused mostly? Yeah.
Yeah, so I work with, people all over the world, and I also sometimes get clients through who aren't frontline workers, especially with the breath work. I found that a lot of entrepreneurs and professionals are really interested in the breath work, so it is open to anyone. At present, I'm only on Instagram, and my account is Healing Blue Hearts.
Okay.
But in the next few months, I will be having a website built, which will also, you can find the link through my Instagram once that's created.
Okay. Well, if you need help with that, Desiree is an amazing SEO website builder person.
Well, that is really good to know. I might touch base with you, Desiree, after that. That's great.
No, that's fantastic. Healing Blue Hearts. Did you come up with that yourself?
Yes, and it's a nod to the blue light services that we call the frontline responders in the UK. I don't know if it's similar where you are. But yeah, it's a nod to the frontline workers out there.
Much needed service. So thank you for what you're doing.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. We'll have everything linked below, your Instagram and stuff, and then more about you. And we'll keep an eye out for your website, and we'll go ahead and link that once that's up.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.